Even after Speaker Mike Johnson broke the deadlock and Congress and Biden authorized $61 billion in aid to Ukraine back in April, there is a question of, is the U.S. doing enough? Or the U.S. is sending things like artillery shells, anti-air missiles, armored vehicles. But also what many reports didn't mention at that time was almost none of what we're talking about is actually going to reach Ukrainian soil anytime soon. Or more than $23 billion is meant to replenish U.S. military stocks that were depleted because they went to Ukraine. Then over $11 billion is going towards current U.S. military operations in the region. Around $10 billion is going to Ukraine in the form of a loan, not weapons. And then, as far as the cash meant to buy arms directly for Ukraine, it's going to trickle out slowly. So in April, the Pentagon funneled $6 billion to U.S. contractors to manufacture new equipment, which will take months, if not years, with it immediately releasing only about $1 billion worth of existing stockpiles to Ukraine so far. So while Ukrainians celebrated the new influx of aid, it may be too little too late to reverse the course of the war. Since October, when U.S. assistance ran dry, Ukraine has lost over 200 square miles of eastern territory to Russian forces. And now you have experts unsure whether Kyiv will be able to retake the initiative. But with everyone so focused on the question of whether U.S. aid would keep flowing for the past several months, the question of how helpful that aid's actually been has gotten a lot less attention. Right, so for this story, what we're talking about today, I want to take a look at some of the ways that we Americans have sorely disappointed our friends in Ukraine, starting with a device that's brought about what some call a technological revolution in modern warfare. Drones. Right, the conflict in Ukraine is the first war to feature small drones as a central part of the battlefield. Right, and I don't mean the big winged kind that fly at 30,000 feet and fire missiles at targets on the ground. Rather, I'm talking about these small commercial kind that drop off your Amazon package or take cool YouTube videos. Because those things, they cost a fraction of an artillery shell. They can be mass produced and they are extremely effective at what they do. Right, people can just strap a bomb to one of these things, fly it into a tank, a truck, a group of soldiers. They don't even know what hit them. Potentially knocking out a several $1 million piece of armor with something that's literally held together by duct tape. And around the middle of the war, these little bastards were giving Putin the ass whooping that he deserves, with the Russian offensive in winter of 2022-2023 stalling after drones helped shred columns of tanks and armored vehicles. Or in other cases, surveillance drones pinpointed targets for rockets and artillery. And then in the summer, that pattern flipped, with the Ukrainian counteroffensive stalling because every time they gathered more than a few tanks and infantry fighting vehicles together, Russian surveillance drones spotted them and called in the artillery, chopper fire, and attack drones, causing enemy forces to disperse into smaller units. And so with all this, some observers have concluded that this new technology alters the traditional logic of warfare. The way conventional fighting usually works is that both sides confront each other on the battlefield. They set up their fortifications and then they try to push the other back. But if neither one can get the upper hand, they basically sit still and they look for opportunities to make a breakthrough. Right? That being when one side quickly concentrates its forces at one point on the front before the other can react, then punching through, forcing the enemy to retreat. But now, with surveillance drones buzzing around everywhere, feeding real-time intelligence on enemy troop movements back to headquarters, it has become much harder to hide large concentrations of soldiers from the enemy. And once they spot you, it's only a matter of minutes before the missiles, artillery, or kamikaze drones come flying in. So amassing the forces necessary to create a breakthrough on the front, it's challenging in a way that it's never been before, which also may be one reason why both sides have struggled to make rapid territorial gains in Ukraine. And it's certainly a big reason why Ukraine withdrew US M1 Abrams tanks from the front lines recently, meaning these $10 million tanks, 31 of which the US sent to Ukraine, either have to find a new purpose or just admit that they were a waste of money. But each side has also tried to outmaneuver the other with countermeasures that render their technology useless. Right? Most notably, they target the enemy's drones with jammers, scrambling certain radio frequencies that either leave the drone operator blind or make the drone fly off course. But then, the drone operators, they respond by switching frequencies, prompting the jammers to follow suit, and so it becomes this endless game of cat and mouse. Also, there's a technology that can trace a drone signal back to its pilot, exposing their location, which is naturally followed up by a barrage of artillery fire on that spot. But you have the operators responding to that threat by using signal repeaters, or basically a device that works kind of like a VPN. It obscures the original source of the directions being sent to the drone. Also with this, AI-operated drones could theoretically solve both problems, right? Because they just fly and select targets themselves, no pilots or operators required. Though that also gets us into that thorny debate about the ethics of completely AI-driven killing machines that have no human oversight. Right? But the point that we're touching on here is that half the battle, that's getting a technological advantage over your opponent, which is why it's so important that the technology America sends to Ukraine actually serves their needs. And so far, we're not doing great there. Right? Pretty much everyone, from former US defense officials to Ukrainian commanders to drone company employees, are telling the Wall Street Journal that American drones tend to be expensive, glitchy, and hard to repair, adding that they're fragile and unable to overcome Russian jamming and GPS blackout technology. Right? And at times, they can't take off, complete missions, or return home. And they often fail to fly at the distances advertised or carry substantial payloads. And this is some American and Ukrainian officials say that legal restrictions on drone parts and testing make US companies too slow to respond to the changing battlefield needs, which is especially bad for drone battles that sometimes require daily updates and upgrades. And so with Western help largely a big flop, Ukraine's turned to China for tens of thousands of cheaper off-the-shelf drones instead, which for each one can cost tens of thousands of dollars less than their American competitors. I mean, you have workers in factories soldering together components and then mounting them onto carbon fiber frames for no more than $350. And according to the journal, Ukrainian forces are burning through about 10,000 drones a month like this, which they definitely could not afford if they had to buy them from the United States. But also, while we talk about this, I don't want to overstate how transformative this tech is. Right? Even if the traditional model of forcing breakthroughs at that front is less viable now, there are ways to adapt with different strategies. With one analyst arguing in Foreign Policy that Ukrainian commanders have found success using so-called bite and hold infiltration tactics, right, where infantry supported by artillery fire makes smaller incremental gains. So for example, armored personnel carriers ferry small groups of soldiers to the front lines and then push forward one tree line after another. Also, there are ways to evade detection from drones, like going underground, as well as taking advantage of the terrain, time of day, and weather conditions to stay hidden, which is something that the Ukrainians have done, conducting most of their assaults under cover of darkness. And sure, infrared cameras can nullify that tactic, but they cost more, and so there's less of them leaving blind spots. But nevertheless, it is undeniable that drones have changed the face of modern warfare. And one thing that they've done, besides blow up fancy equipment, is show how important information is. Because when you've got thousands of drones buzzing around taking videos of everything, you need a way to bring all that data together and create a single coherent picture. And that is where Project Maven comes in. Right? And this US military software is one of the most successful examples of what the Pentagon now calls algorithmic warfare, with Ukrainian commanders feeding not just drone videos, but also commercial satellite imagery, geolocation data, and information taken from Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram channels into it. Then the algorithm sifts through all of that, connecting the dots and doing work that would have traditionally taken hundreds of intelligence analysts to accomplish. And finally, it predicts where troops are moving and where attacks might happen, spitting out potential targets for commanders to choose from. But also, of note, as amazing as all that sounds, you have the New York Times reporting that its effectiveness so far has been mixed. Right? Because while the flow of data did help Ukraine target Russian artillery, field commanders say that the initial hope that soldiers in the trenches would access that data in real time using phones or tablets, it's never really been realized. So unsurprisingly, US and NATO officials are recording everything that we've talked about thus far in a series of lessons learned studies. And not just to better help Ukraine, but also to prepare for potential future conflicts with Russia or China. Because this is the first time a lot of Western equipment has actually been tested on the battlefield against another modern industrialized military. Because the United States hasn't fought a war like the one Ukraine's embroiled in since Korea in the early 1950s. And since then, its battlefield experience has primarily been against weaker guerrilla forces in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, or places where fancy, expensive weapon systems are more feasible because they don't have to worry about countermeasures from comparable adversaries. So you have the director of a foundation that raises money to provide Ukrainian units with equipment telling the journal, a lot of Western armor doesn't work here because it had been created not for an all-out war, but for conflicts of low or medium intensity. If you throw it into a mass offensive, it just doesn't perform. So he says that the military should focus on making larger quantities of cheaper, simpler systems. Kind of like what the Allies did in World War II, mass-producing American Sherman tanks and Soviet T-34s. But those were much weaker than German Tiger and Panther tanks, but there were far more of them and they were easier to repair in the field. But today in Ukraine, while that World War era quantity over quality rule is arguably still true, the epic tank-on-tank battles of old are extremely rare now because of drones. And that striking mixture of old and new, that's why a former Pentagon official once referred to Ukraine as World War I with 21st century weapons. You've got trenches and minefields, drones and AI all on the same battlefield. But as the Times points out, the old stuff like basic weapons, ammunition, and artillery, they're just as, if not more important for winning the war than the new toys. So that's why I really want to clarify and hit that even as disappointing as much of the Western aid has been, it is still a total game changer for Ukraine, and the latest package approved in April could rescue their defenses, which gives us all the more reason to study our mistakes and improve. And by us, I actually mean the Pentagon, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and pretty much all the assholes that I'm usually criticizing. Because yeah, I mean, that's actually how the world is run. Information, death, and money.